Welcome, my friend, to the On the Blue Line podcast for law enforcement with Wayne Mulder. I'm your host, Wayne Mulder, and this is the podcast where we help law enforcement overcome the mental health toll of the profession to become better leaders and protectors on and off the job. On today's 156th episode of the podcast, have you ever heard of an officer wanting to head home so badly that they make up a story about a dead body coming back to life, walking out into the hallway, and then dying again? Yeah, me either. But you'll want to listen to today's podcast so you can hear that one. This is our weekly interview show. It's called The Interview Room. Our other show is called Morning Roll Call, which that one's a monologue show, comes out on Mondays. And just know that both shows are released on YouTube and Rumble and video, if that would be your preferred format. And you can find out more about all of it at On the Blue Line, ontheblueline.com. So let me tell you about this week's guest. Vic Ferrari is the author of NYPD Through the Looking Glass, Stories from Inside America's Largest Police Department, the NYPD's Flying Circus, Cops, Crime, and Chaos, Grand Theft Auto, the NYPD's Auto Crime Division, and NYPD Law and Disorder. He's a retired 20-year member of the New York City Police Department who refuses to write in chronological order. With no formal training or a Harvard degree, Vic's managed to write 4 behind-the-scenes books about the NYPD with remarkable, as he says, attention to detail combined with a sarcastic flair. Vic exposes the good, the bad, and the ugly of America's largest police department. As you can tell, Vic has quite the sense of humor, and his sarcastic flair comes out throughout this conversation, and you're not going to want to miss his other crazy stories that we talk about, from practical jokes to a bathroom scuffle that I guarantee you will leave you laughing. So, without taking any more time, here's this week's guest, Vic Ferrari. Well, Vic, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
I'm looking forward to this. I love the name you write under, Vic Ferrari. I mean, this is going to be fun no matter what we talk about. I know that for sure.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it all week.
Let me start with my get to know you questions. These are the easy ones. Is it coffee or tea for you, Vic?
Coffee, and I was a tea drinker most of my NYPD career. The last couple of years I worked with a guy and he got me turned on to coffee. I was in my late 30s and he says, listen, you're an adrenaline junkie. You know, he goes, we're hitting our 40s. He goes, you're starting to get tired in the afternoon. Try coffee. And I hated it. But now, as you can see, drinking coffee.
That is a good answer. Is it just black coffee or are you a cream and sugar guy, Vic?
Stevia, and it's not because I'm environmentally conscious or anything. I'm just trying to keep my sugar level down.
Yeah, I think we all end up there eventually.
Yeah, and milk.
Where's your favorite place to have that drink? Do you got a peaceful spot that you just like to have a sip of coffee in the mornings?
Yeah, in the morning or in the afternoon. I'm down to 2 cups a day, so usually on the couch, and that's when I'll do my writing, first thing in the morning or later in the afternoon.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll definitely get more into your writing. I love what you've been doing. But do you have a best or worst travel story?
Best or worst travel story? Worst would be when I was a kid. We didn't have any money. I mean, I grew up in the Bronx, my lower middle class family. My parents scrimped and saved throughout the year to take us on vacation. And one year we drove across the United States in a 1975 Chevy Malibu with no air conditioning from the Bronx to California, down the coast of California, and then back. And I mean, the only thing that saved my brother and I was a Coleman cooler that separated us from beating the shit out of each other in the back seat. But it was like, you just picture going across the United States in July or August with no air conditioning.
Yeah. Kids today have no idea. Yeah. I had several similar stories growing up with my parents and no air conditioning. And there was 3 of us kids, so we were sandwiched in that back seat.
Right. And there was no handheld video games. So it was Mad Libs or a book. Yep. Or you played poker with the license plates that drove by, or, name different states. All right, I got an Alabama, But I mean, literally, it was just farmland after farmland driving through this great country of ours in the heat.
That's awesome. That is a great story. It took me back with that one there, Vic. So you've been on a lot of podcasts. So let me ask you, what is something that rarely gets asked that the listener should know about you?
Rarely gets asked.
Yeah, because you get asked so many things, and it's always around law enforcement, which we're going to get to here in a minute. But what's something we ought to know about you that doesn't get asked a lot?
I guess about my personal life, because I mean it's two separate entities. I'm a writer. I'm retired from law enforcement. Basically, I lead a boring life, and I like it that way. It's like I was telling you off air. I mean, I got into writing these books because it was fun, and then I wanted to make a little money with it, but I didn't necessarily want to be famous. You know what I mean? I guess my personal life, a lot of times they don't ask any questions, which is just fine by me.
Right. Yeah, no, very, very interesting. So take us back a little bit to your origin story then, because you ended up in law enforcement. Can you walk us into that? What brought you into law enforcement in the first place, where you worked?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in the Bronx. I always wanted to be a New York City police officer and then detective. When I was a little boy, my mother used to take me to the movie theater, and around the corner from the movie theater was a police station. So I was 5, 6 years old, running up to the police car and looking in the window and looking at the hats and the nightsticks. I used to watch the cops outside with their hands on the butt of their gun, talking to each other. And, every little boy sees that gun and you're playing cops or robbers. I'm like, I want one of those things. By the age of 10, we used to go, me and my friends used to go to the local post office and steal FBI wanted posters. And we'd run around the neighborhood. I'd have a wanted poster for Billy Ray Jack wanted for an armed robbery in Alabama. And I'm in the local deli sizing up some construction worker like, yeah, this could be him. So I always knew what I wanted to do, grew up watching the Rockford Files and the French Connection and the 7-Up and all the police shows. So by 20, I took the police exam. By 21, I was in the police academy. And, at an early age, by 21 years old, I was a New York City police officer, walking a beat in the South Bronx.
Wow. One question that you've mentioned on some of your stuff, and I've seen it on some of the things that you've written, but what was it like working for the New York City Police Department? I'm asking that from the mindset. One of the questions I get a lot, like we talked off air, I'm down here in Florida. I work in a county area. That experience of someone in here versus someone in, say, Wyoming versus someone with the New York City Police Department, what's it really like?
It's wild. I mean, I had a great career. I mean, and if I could go back to the future and do it all over again in that time period, I would do it all over again, even not knowing what I know now. It was great. A 20-year career in the New York City Police Department is what you make of it. Granted, there's nepotism in the department. If your dad is above the rank of captain, if you want to work in aviation, you're going to go to aviation. If you want to work in mounted, you're going to go to mounted, right? But if you keep your head down, do the work, get good evaluations, don't do something stupid, you can do it. It's like the American dream. You can really do whatever you want in the New York City Police Department. There's so many opportunities, but it's like having a front row seat to the greatest show on earth. You know what I mean? It's like any given day, there's all this wild stuff going on. There's fire eaters, there's clowns, there's guys walking around picking up shit after the horses and the elephants. I mean, there's just so much going on. And I equate it also to it's a 20-year merry-go-round. You got your ups, your downs, but you got to know when to get off that merry-go-round. And I think that's in law enforcement in general.
Oh, yeah.
It's a young man's game. And no matter how good you are, everybody eventually outlives their usefulness. Yeah, you're a great detective or you're a great SWAT commander. Slowly but surely, the landscape's going to change. Society's going to change. Supervisor's going to change. And you're not flavor of the month anymore. And you got to know when to get off that merry-go-round or Seabiscuit is going to throw you on your head.
I love your sense of humor. Let me ask you, what kind of positions have you held or did you hold when you were at the police? And two questions, actually. What years are we talking to? What years were you there? What decades?
Yeah, I was active from 1987 to 2007, and I worked in a lot of units because, again, there's so many different opportunities there. So I moved around a lot. I worked in a South Bronx precinct. If you ever saw the movie Fort Apache, The Bronx with Paul Newman, that's supposed to be the 4-1, which was called Fort Apache. The reality is by the time I went to the 4-2, which was its sister precinct where they actually filmed it, we used to call it Little House on the Prairie because it was all burned out. I worked in a DUI unit, which I absolutely hated, but I was a rookie and you do what you're told. I worked in plainclothes probably 15 out of my 20 years. I worked in like an anti-crime unit where you're an unmarked car, robbery in progress, burglary in progress, pickpockets. You're responding to things like that. I worked in the Manhattan North Narcotics Division in the early 90s doing buy and bust operations. I wasn't a deep undercover per se. I was an investigator, but I did buy drugs a handful of times because they needed, a white guy to go on a set. And my last 10 years, I was a detective in the NYPD's auto crime division. So anything with chop shops, exporting stolen vehicles out of the country, changing vehicle identification numbers for resale, a lot of organized crime stuff. And I did that for my last 10 years.
Okay. Yeah, I would have to think that has got to be crazy out of New York. Like you've got to be getting into, so like you said, organized crime, probably international type stuff. I mean, are there any specific cases or anything you can talk about or anything interesting that we would?
Oh, plenty. Yeah. So in the 90s, when I went to the auto crime division, New York City, the 5 boroughs of New York City was averaging over 150,000 stolen vehicles a year. Okay. So it was like shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, even before I went to the auto crime division, I was always a car guy. Like if you knew what to look for and you had a computer in the car, you were going to get a stolen car arrest, Yeah, in the NYPD, in the auto crime division, it's more going to the root of the problem. Yes, we would pick off the garden variety pain in the ass car thief, the kids, the juveniles joyriding, or a junkie that steals a car to get around and get high and run his errands or whatever. But we went more to the root of the problem as far as, like you said, exporting stolen cars out of the country. Mafia, one of the 5 family, organized crime, body shops, salvage yards. I worked on a case where we had Chinese nationals that had settled in Brooklyn, and the guy was an he was a Chinese military intelligence officer, and he hooked up with a Jamaican in the Bronx. And what they were doing was the Jamaican would put in orders for stolen cars because the Jamaican guy knew all these car thieves. So they were stealing between 25 to 30 Audi A6s a month. The cars would get stolen through the 5 boroughs and the outer counties. The cars would go park somewhere. They would cool off for a couple of days to make sure they didn't have like low jack or tracking devices. They would go into this warehouse out in Brooklyn where you had Chinese nationals working. And what they would do is they would drive 2 stolen vehicles into a shipping container. They would let the air out of the tires so the cars would sit low in the container. Then they would build a hoist and a frame above it where they could put 1 or 2 more stolen vehicles above it. So they wanted to maximize the container. Right. From there, a legit trucking company would take that container out of the warehouse in Brooklyn, take it out to Newark, New Jersey, where it got put on trains. And then the shipping containers with the stolen vehicles would get railed across the United States to Long Beach, California, where they were put on cargo ships and then shipped to Shanghai. So, I mean, it was a big case. We did it. If you ever watch Fox News, Judge Jeanine Pirro.
Yeah.
She was all right. So before she was on television, she was the district attorney of Westchester County. Westchester County was getting killed with Audis. The New York City area was getting killed with Audis. So we pooled our resources and did a joint case with them. So New York City is so big, like we have between 35 and 40,000 cops at any given moment, right? So we had Chinese cops that spoke Mandarin and Cantonese. We pulled them off patrol and had them monitoring the Chinese wiretaps. Then we had Spanish detectives monitoring our car thieves with Spanish. So they were speaking in Spanish a lot of time, monitoring their phone calls. And what we quickly realized is, in addition to this international, stolen vehicle shipping ring, these guys were in the murder for hire business. Oh, so wow. Then the car thieves start talking about whacking this guy, or you want to wind up like this guy in Connecticut. It's like, oh, this is good. So when we eventually took the case down, we pretty much solved 15 homicides and, busted up this international car theft ring.
That's awesome. Now, did you guys just keep it at the state and local level, or did you guys bring the feds in on this since you've got Long Beach and all these?
No, we didn't need them. They came in. Well,
you were very clear about that there.
We needed them. Well, we needed customs.
Okay.
Obviously, because they're getting shipped. So the vehicles were being shipped, and then customs wound up telling the FBI, and then the FBI came sniffing around. But by the time, what's funny is it probably would have been a federal. I don't know if Piero would have given that case over to the FBI. She was a tough cookie. But what wound up happening is the case got blown up because we were going to, we were in this case for about a year, and we just kept getting more and more stuff, and more dirtbags were walking on the playing field with more and more stuff. And what wound up happening was they got greedy. And the Chinese, I mean, the thieves, I mean, there was like 5 or 6 different steal teams, and they couldn't keep up with the orders. I mean, as many cars as they were stealing, they were shipping. So what wound up happening is the main thief used to work as a parking attendant in Upper East Side in Manhattan parking garage. So he goes to one of his friends who still works in the garage and says, listen, what I'd like you to do is I'm going to show up with 10 guys, give us the keys to 10 luxury cars. We'll tie you up. We'll put you in the trunk of one of the cars, wait a half hour, start banging on the trunk, say a bunch of guys with ski masks robbed you, and I'll give you $3,000. So guys like, all right, now we got all this on. We know this is going to happen because we've got all the phone calls intercept. Right. So, I mean, we had a camera outside. We watched them go in. We watched the cars leave. We hear the 911 call. We hear the Upper East Side for 19th Precinct respond, right? So what winds up happening is they bring all the cars. They got greedy. They didn't park the cars on the street. They brought them all into this warehouse. And what wound up happening is one of the cars had LoJack. So the following morning, one of the owners reports the car stolen. They activate the LoJack. What happens? The beacon now is pinging in the garage. Well, organized, like in the auto crime division, we're part of organized crime. We don't tell the precinct cops what we're doing. Right. And you know this working in law enforcement. If we told the local precinct, yeah, see that warehouse over there? There's an international shipping case. The cops, they would be parked in front eating lunch there, taking photos of it. You know cops.
Oh, yeah.
They got to know. So we didn't tell them. The cops go rushing into this warehouse and they see Chinese guys walking around and they're like, and they had a false wall. So they didn't see the cars at first. So they're like, why are there Chinese guys in this warehouse? Or what, you know, and the Chinese guys, they were smart. They were handing them these bogus manifests of like toys. It was supposed to be like a toy factory or something. The Chinese went out the back door. The cops discovered the stolen cars, and now our phones are blowing up because, like, oh shit, these guys are going to be out of the country like in 24 hours. So it was like, oh God. I mean, I grabbed me and my partner. We had two of the Chinese nationals lived on a street in Brooklyn. All we had were surveillance photos. Like we didn't have them ID'd yet. We didn't know their name. We just knew they were coming and going out of the 6-story building. That's all we knew. We didn't know the apartment, nothing. And I'll never forget, we turned the corner and I see these 2 Chinese guys running out of the building with suitcases. I go, how about them? And we stopped and we start talking to them. And I put my hand on the guy's chest and it felt like it was going to blow out. And then we had Chinese cops doing the surveillance on them. And they were like, that's them, that's him. And we got them ID'd really quick. But yeah, it was a scramble because I think we rounded up probably close to 30 people in a couple of hours because everybody was going in different directions. So those phones were very important. Like one guy, I'm going to Florida, I'm jumping on an Amtrak. And the guys we grabbed had plane tickets in their pocket. They had open tickets because this is pre 9/11. They had tickets to Toronto. So they were on their way to the airport. We just had, and these guys were the factory workers. We would have never have gotten them had we not just jumped on them that minute.
Yeah. Well, that's something I'm sure the non-law enforcement listeners, I mean, that is one of the things with these long, protracted investigations is you think it's moving at one pace all along, you know, for 12 months. And I saw this a lot in economic crimes. And then all of a sudden something would happen. In one case we had, it ended up being a domestic fight. And that domestic fight led to everything we needed to take action. And just like you were just saying, you had to take action immediately before people disappeared on you. So.
Yeah, and then I mean, and obviously, like there was a point in the case where I think it was the Jamaican guy was talking about whacking a guy. So now, armed with this information, right, you've got to warn this person. Yeah. You know, the guy might be a dirtbag, but I mean, you know, you've got to go to this person and say, listen, we've got credible. But what it wound up being was, and the Jamaican guy wasn't involved in any of the homicides. He was content getting his $5,000 a car. So he was getting paid $5,000 a car, and then he was farming out, paying guys between $500 and $1,000, depending on how good they were. And he was just blowing smoke. He was just talking about, you know, he got into a fight with a guy in a club. He was talking about killing him, and then we had to figure out who this guy was, right? And tell him. You know, we didn't tell him. We heard on a wiretap that this is the guy, but we were like, listen, have you had problems with anybody lately? He's like, yeah, a couple of people. I'm like, well, you might want to, you know, maybe take off for a while, you know, until this blows over.
Exactly. Consider your enemies at this point.
That's a funny story. I got one more funny story, not about this, but one time there was this kid out in Jersey, and how did I get this? Oh, I had an informant. He was a dirtbag too. But anyway, there was this kid out in New Jersey that stole a whole bunch of stuff. He robbed a chop shop, essentially, is what he did. Yeah. And the guy that owned the chop shop wanted him dead. So our informant warned us about it. And he was cooling his heels out in a county jail in New Jersey. So I pull him out, and he does, he's from New Jersey. Why does the NYPD want to talk to me and stuff? And I says, listen, this, you got problems. Like, someone's looking to whack you. And he goes, why would anybody? Like, it was like the last thing on his mind. He goes, why would anybody? Like he's a great guy. Why would anybody want to kill me? I'm like, why are you here? He goes, oh, I stole a whole bunch. He goes, oh. I said, yeah. I says, maybe you might not want to make bail. You might want to hang here for a while.
Yeah,
but
safest place you can be.
It used to happen from time to time. We'd get a tip that, it's a lot of times it was just guys running their mouth, but you still got to tip the guy off.
Well, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you don't know the credibility of the threat, but and these people run in circles where they're upsetting the wrong people, that's for sure. Let me ask you, you're known for your sense of humor, and obviously we're going to get to your books in a minute too that have good use of sarcasm in them, but you mentioned practical jokes. Any great stories or anything you can talk about when it comes to do cops play practical jokes, and anything specifically from your time in law enforcement?
Yeah, sure. In my book, NYPD Through the Looking Glass, there's a whole chapter on practical jokes because I wanted to break the myth that cops are these stoic, robotic, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. This, when someone approaches you in the street, it's not to bring you cookies or they got a problem. And you don't know if they're the bad guy. A lot of times people come to law enforcement like they're in the right and it turns out they're the asshole. You know what I mean? So cops are very measured until they get to know you a little bit. But behind the scenes in an NYPD locker room, yeah, I mean, when I was a detective, you're working in an office with 20 trained observers. They notice anything, right? Your haircut, anything. So close to the end of my tour, I changed my slacks. I had a date. I go to get a cup of coffee, and one of the guys soaks my chair with ice water. I sit down. I get the wet ass. Everybody's laughing, having a great time. I'm like, all right, you got me. I go upstairs. I get changed. I go back downstairs, and across the street from our office was a pet store. I went into the pet store. I bought a bag of 100 crickets.
Okay.
I went into the parking lot. I used the Slim Jim. I popped open the door to his personal car. I opened it up. The bag, those crickets stunk too. And I dumped all the crickets in the backseat of his car and I shut the door. He wound up having to sell the car because he bombed it with roach spray a couple of times, but you don't get them all. And then they would start breeding again.
Right.
So, I mean, it was a shitbox car. It was like an old 98 or something, but he wound up getting rid of it. The stuff when I was on patrol, you would especially during the summertime, you'd wait till a sector car went into the station house for their meal hour. We would open up their car, pull the vents out, and then pour cornstarch down the AC vents, and then put the vents back in and put the AC on high. So when they got in the car and they started up, poof, they looked like they worked in a bakery.
Right.
Yeah. There was a guy one time, he wasn't too well liked, and Rogaine had just come out. Oh, no. And he made the mistake of leaving his locker open. And someone saw that bottle of Rogaine. I didn't do this, by the way. They took the Rogaine bottle, they emptied the contents out in another container, and they put wood stain in his Rogaine bottle. And then he shellacked the top of his head. I mean, they had to restrain him. Like, he lost his fucking mind.
I'm sure he did. Those are great. Yeah, and that's the thing. And I have seen some practical jokes and so forth, but I always love hearing these stories, especially from cities like New York. It is just a different experience when I hear these stories from you guys that served up there in the Northeast. So you left in 2007. So that means were you in the city on 9/11?
Oh yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that experience? I've had someone on the show, Samantha Horwitz, who talked about being in the towers on 9/11. She was serving with the feds during that time, but I'd be curious hearing about it from your perspective.
Yeah, my office was in the Bronx, which with no traffic is about a 45-minute ride down to Lower Manhattan. That particular day, I went to my office in the Bronx. I had Manhattan Criminal Court, which is walking distance to the World Trade Center. I had locked up some guy for some stolen cars. He was going to flip and become an informant and give us a guy in Harlem DMV that was pumping out driver's licenses. So my sergeant and I were going to come in at 7 a.m, go down to Manhattan Court, pull this guy out and try to work out a confidential informant agreement. And my sergeant was running behind. He's supposed to be there at 7. He's not there at 7. He walks through the door at 8, and I'm on his ass like, come on, we got to go. We got to get downtown. Yeah. Well, what winds up happening is the first plane hits. One of the cops from downstairs runs upstairs, tells us to put on the television set. As we're watching this, the second plane hits. So we knew it was terrorism. Call came from downtown. Everybody get into uniform. And by 1:30, I was down there walking around. It was like something out of a movie. You can't, it was, the closer you got, like we parked on the west side and then we kind of came in through Broadway, we cut through like one of the side streets. And the closer you got to ground zero, because of all that debris that was blown in the air, the sunlight had a difficult time getting through the particles of that stuff. It was like volcanic ash like blowing around.
Yeah.
And so it was like a weird haze. It was like a twilight haze. Everything was covered in that debris, asbestos and ground up concrete. But the thing that I'll never forget is as we're coming down Broadway, we see thousands upon thousands of pairs of women's shoes. So you had all these women that worked on Wall Street and the Twin Towers. When they were running away, they took their high heels off to get the hell out of there. So, it was just like odd, you just saw all these shoes and then it was like, oh, all right. And when we got like literally up to the pile, there was all sorts of crazy shit. Like a guy walked by in a spacesuit with a Geiger counter. I'm like, who the fuck is this? Like, is he from the government or is it a guy from New Jersey with a Geiger counter that thought like today's the day? I'm going to go down there and see if this thing works. Right. There was a piece of the facade that had come down thousands of feet and just was like stuck in front of the pile. It was weird. And it was like the last scene of Planet of the Apes when Charlton Heston sees the Statue of Liberty head on the beach. And he's like, holy shit. Like that's, because I'm like, what is that? And they're like, that's the facade of the building. So it was just, it was chaos down there. We didn't really know what to do. It just was the first day I was down there from like 1:30 in the afternoon. I didn't go home till like 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. We got dismissed. They told us, go home, get some rest, run your clothes through a washing machine and be back at the office up in the Bronx by about 5:30. We're coming back. So I was doing like 12, 13-hour tours for the first couple of days.
Okay.
Then they pulled us back and I worked in auto crime. So then they sent us out to the dump. So there was this long abandoned landfill out in Staten Island that they reopened when they started getting heavy equipment in there and starting to pull out stuff. And they had us like, when they were pulling vehicles out of that, they had us chopping the vehicles up to make sure nobody was trapped inside.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's incredible. Things you don't even think about. Yeah, it is definitely, I can't even imagine being.
Oh, you know how many cars and police trucks and fire engines? Like, just rows and rows and rows stacked on top of each other. Thousands of vehicles, or hundreds.
Yeah, those are things you don't even think of. This whole thing with the women's shoes, that's just, it makes sense because you see that, when you're wearing the high heels or whatever, your wife always takes them off, to carry them or whatever. And if you're running from something like that fateful morning, yeah, absolutely. That's just amazing. At some point, you decide you want to become a writer. What was that process all about?
Well, after I retired from the NYPD, I was bored out of my mind. So I came down to Florida. I got my certification. I became a cop down in Florida. And I worked for a small municipality, which was a great department. But here's the deal. I'm in my early 40s, and now I'm going back on the road. I went from being a detective in America's largest police department to being back on the road, which is a young man's game. And now it's the domestics. Now it's the DUIs. And I'm like, it was like a bad episode of Reno 911. It's different down here. Like I had a half-a-day class on how to wrestle an alligator. And I'm like, can we just fucking shoot these things? No. Every car's got duct tape in the. I'm like, I'm not duct taping one of these things. No fucking way, man. So I did that for about 8 months. They were a great department, but it was me. I was just too old. The game changed. I should have stayed retired. And at the urging of friends and family, they said, you got all these wild stories. You should really write them down. And I was apprehensive because I didn't know how this was going to get viewed by my peers. That weighed heavily on me. So I said, if I'm going to write these books, a couple of things I don't want to do is I don't want to get anybody divorced. I don't want to get anybody in trouble. I don't want to embarrass anybody. So in my books, I mean, they're all loaded with short stories of behind the scenes things that happen in the NYPD, but I changed the names, the dates, the locations, people I like, even people I didn't like. I don't want to single anybody out. But I mean, I get phone calls from my friends every time a book drops. I know who you're writing about, So, it became a cottage industry. I started writing these books and they started selling. And now I'm, to sell them, people like yourself with these forums and television shows and podcasts are nice enough to put me on to hawk my books.
That's awesome. Was your first one Through the Looking Glass, NYPD Through the Looking Glass? Was that the first of your books, or?
No, my first book is called Dickheads and Debauchery and Other Ingenious Ways to Die. It has nothing to do about police work. It's about the ridiculous things people do to shorten their life expectancy. Actually, it's a picture of a fat guy and a wife beater drinking a beer on a ladder, smoking a cigarette, playing with electricity.
I love that. I absolutely love that. So tell us a little bit about that book. Is that available on Amazon as well?
Yeah. All my books are available on Amazon, but it's just the ridiculous things that I saw. And I guess there's police stories in there, but it's just the ridiculous things that, I've seen throughout my life that people do to shorten their life expectancy. Like, why are you going to travel all the way to Spain to run with the Bulls? You really want to take your life in your hands and be scared shitless? Go down to Manhattan and ride the subway at midnight. You'll get way more excitement. It'll be a lot cheaper.
Yeah. Well, the subway anymore may not be considered safer either, but that's a different conversation.
Very true. Yeah. So my first NYPD book is NYPD Through the Looking Glass: Stories from Inside America's Largest Police Department.
Very cool. So you want to just walk us through a little bit on what the readers can expect, or the listeners who will hopefully become readers can expect to find when they get these books from Amazon?
Yeah, there's no beginning, middle, end in my books. It's just they're perfect travel books. It's a chapter and then there's stories with it. So there's a chapter in NYPD Through the Looking Glass called Practical Jokers. And it's like the stories I laid out earlier. Another chapter from one of my books, Crossing Over the Dark Side. It's cops that I saw go bad. You know what I mean? And got themselves in all sorts of trouble. And some actually went to jail. The opening chapter of my book, NYPD Law and Disorder, there's a chapter called Embarrassing Moments, where I write about some really embarrassing things happen to me on my days on patrol, and I kept the stories to myself, obviously, until 30 years later when I got into writing books.
Right. Yeah, it's funny how that all changes once we get a platform of some sort, and then you start telling these stories to everybody. And you're like, I didn't want anyone to know about this back in the day.
Oh, well, God, in that Embarrassing Moments chapter, it opens up with, I'm in a public restroom, and I took my gun belt off, and I hung it in the stall on the hook. And these teenagers ran into the bathroom, and they were roughhousing and stuff. One runs into the next stall. He jumps on the toilet, and he's reaching over to grab my gun belt. So now I'm taking a dump. I jump up with my left hand and start pulling up my uniform pants. And with my right hand, I grab him around the neck and I pull him. But what I inadvertently did was when I pull him towards me, now he can grab the gun belt with two hands. So now I drop my pants to the floor and I'm in a hockey fight. So I got this fucker around the neck and I'm a righty. So I'm at a disadvantage hitting him lefty, right?
Right.
And I'm hitting him, I'm yelling, let go of the gun belt. His friends run into the next stall and they grab his legs. Now it's a tug of war for my gun belt with this kid, right? Finally, he drops the gun belt, right? When he drops the gun belt, they pull, and you know the partition in a public restroom? It's like made out of aluminum. That thing, it bucked. So the whole thing went crashing over to the other side into the next stall. He drops the gun belt. I pull up my pants. I put on my gun belt. I go charging out after him, and they hit the food court. They were gone. And I write in the book, I mean, they're gone, and I'm standing there, and I got the radio in my hand, and I'm like, who am I going to call? The police? The responding cops are going to show up, and the Bronx is a small place. Like, I'm going to be the laughing stock in the Bronx, right? So I kept that story to myself. I just put the radio back, and I'm like, and what the funny thing is, I was in that food court because that night I had made an arrest with 4 kilos on a car stop. So I was like on top of the world, and I'm like, I'm going to go from a hero to a schmuck, because every cop in the Bronx is going to see me down at court and go, that's the guy that almost got his gun belt taken when he was taking his shit. Right. So I kept that story to myself until 30-something years later.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, do you have more books on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, I've got 6 books out now. I'm writing a 7th. I don't have a title for it yet, but it's the same thing. It's just short stories from my NYPD career.
That's great. Now, I know you mentioned this, Dickheads and Debauchery. Any other books outside the law enforcement genre that you have right now?
Yeah, I wrote my latest book is called Confessions of a Catholic High School Graduate. It's got a picture of a kid getting chased out of a confessional by a priest. That really happened to me. No, I wasn't molested, but when you confess one sin too many, it can lead through a foot chase through a crowd, an empty church. That's about me growing up in the Bronx and being a little son of a bitch and going to Catholic high school and turning my life around.
Yeah. No, that's good. And I love your sense of humor. I like how just in the short conversation with you and some of the stuff that I've read, I just love how you bring your sense of humor to telling these stories. So that's good stuff.
It's a part of my personality. And I wanted to kind of be a little different and I love true crime, love it. I mean, it's pretty much all I read, but I kind of wanted to, most guys that leave law enforcement, the books tend to be serious. I kind of wanted to shine a light that there's a lot of fun stuff that goes on behind the scenes in police work.
Yeah. And that's an important thing for people to understand, because I think sometimes the human side of it gets lost, right? So I think it's important to shine a light on the fun stuff, the silly stuff, and the crazy stuff, because a lot of people have no idea what cops see on a regular basis. So I think it's good to shine a light on this.
Yeah, and I mean, there's stories in there about cops that got themselves in trouble, not criminally, but just did stupid shit that you would never believe. Yeah, I mean, we hire in bulk. The New York City Police Department, a small class, police academy class is like 250. And we've had classes as much as 2,500. So we hire in bulk. So you're going to get morons or bad apples. It's a small percentage, but eventually, they pop up. I mean, there's a story in there. There was a guy, he worked in applicant investigations. So he's in charge of, screening recruits, and his friend's got a criminal record. So he fingerprints himself. So his friend's record, didn't he know that he's got an FBI B number and, he's got a New York State NYPD number? So what happens is he fingerprints himself as his friend. It flags down at NCIC with the FBI. They call the New York City Police Department. He got suspended. Nowadays, he probably would have been fired. There's another story in one of my books. I knew a guy, I didn't particularly like him. He moved a dead body to work to avoid getting out of overtime.
Jeez. What do you do? Drag him across the way, or what do you?
You want to hear the story?
I got that one. I got to hear. Yeah.
All right. So it's the early 90s, and this cop had a foot post near the housing projects. Comes over as a cardiac. He goes up by himself. It was an elderly gentleman that lived in the building, and he was very tight with his neighbor. And when he didn't meet him for coffee that morning, the neighbor went into the apartment, found his friend. Now, the man had only died an hour or two earlier. Yeah. Paramedics arrive. They say, yeah, he's dead. So in New York, when someone dies in an apartment or a house, paramedics come. They say he's dead, right? Then what happens is the detectives come. They check to see if there's foul play, right? Sergeant comes. You do an inventory of the apartment, make sure there's no property or something that shouldn't be there. Then what happens is whoever showed up, that cop has to sit with the body. We call it sitting on a DOA. You've got to sit on that body for hours until the medical examiner comes. And in New York, people are dropping dead all over. So you could be there for 4 to 12 hours waiting for the ME to show up. And when the medical examiner is going to come, he's going to look at their pills and maybe call their doctor off the prescription or something. And the ME is going to say, no, you know what? I want to look into this. They'll send the morgue wagon to take the body down to the morgue for an autopsy. Or the medical examiner will say, yeah, natural death, and tell the family, yeah, go call a funeral home, get your affairs in order. But the cop stays there until the body leaves. So it was a Friday night. This cop was lazy, wanted to go out drinking. As the 2 paramedics are leaving the apartment, he goes, can't you take him? And he says, we don't take him. We don't take him. The only way we would take him if he's in public view. And they leave. So this fucking idiot comes up with the bright idea. He waits a half hour. He gets on the radio. He calls in a cardiac. Well, the same 2 paramedics show up. He was hoping 2 other paramedics would show up. Right. The same 2 come running up into the hallway with all their shit. And now you got a dead body in the hallway. And the guy is starting to have rigor mortis now. So they turn around and they go, what the fuck is this? And now the cop is like, oh shit. He starts backpedaling and he goes, he makes up this bullshit story. He goes, you're not going to believe this. After you left, he jumped up and went, oh shit. He ran through the apartment. He opened the door and he died again in the hallway. And they're like, no, he didn't. He's got lividity. You can see the body was moved. You dragged this fuck through the apartment. Sergeant shows up. They tell him what happened, yada, yada, yada. He gets suspended. He loses 30 vacation days. They put him on a year probation. They transferred him out of borough. That happened nowadays. He would have been on the front page of every New York newspaper.
Heck yeah.
And probably would have lost the job and possibly been arrested.
Right. I was going to say, nowadays, he absolutely would have been arrested. That is a crazy story. I think that actually takes the cake. It's probably one of the craziest stories I've had on this podcast. So let me ask you a question. Obviously, and I'm narrowing down my last couple here, but obviously times are changing. So, and you still write about the profession. You still write about the time that you were in the profession. But what are your thoughts on the direction, kind of, what would you say to officers that are still on the job today? And especially coming from New York City into those in New York City?
I feel terrible for cops right now. They're demonized. They're being used as political pawns. You got politicians that rush to judgment, to pander to their donors or constituents. And they're just, in New York, we were always looked down upon, but at the same time, in different departments across the country, I always used to see cops were treated with a lot more respect than we were up in New York. And now it seems like things are changed and cops are catching shit all over the place now. I think it's wrong. I feel bad for cops. I think, it's funny when they started with these body cams, I think everybody thought, people that aren't police friendly thought, oh, we're going to catch these cops doing all this bad things. And the reality is it points out how difficult a cop's job is and how people do act like assholes and wind up getting themselves locked up, you can say whatever you want. It's there's three sides to a story, but if you got that body cam on and it shows, the cop called me this, he said that, he pulled me over for no reason. Well, you see that he's swerving all over the road, or you see he did this or he did that. So I don't think it's the people that don't like the police. I think the body cam backfired on them.
Yeah. No, I absolutely. In fact, those early days of getting body cameras, it was one of the best ways to eliminate complaints, because someone would call up and be like, hey, I want to complain about so-and-so doing such. And the supervisor could just simply say, hey, no problem. I'm going to take a look at the body camera. Well, never mind. I don't want to make that complaint, or whatever the situation is, because immediately they realized that it was many times going to vindicate the officer.
Yeah. And what's wrong is in New York, if someone pulls that crap, they should be arrested for filing a false police report, but they won't do it in New York. I don't know how it is in other municipalities, but I mean, you could make up the most ridiculous story, and if it gets found untrue, they won't prosecute them. They won't lock them up. Yeah,
for that kind of situation, it wouldn't be prosecuted down here either.
Oh, really?
But yeah, for that kind of thing. Yeah. Now, I mean, if they make an actual police report, that's a different situation, or a CPI type investigation, but not something like that. Not an allegation on. Instead, it would more just they would just unfound it a lot faster and make it rightfully go away. So then one other question I want to ask you, from having this many years in there and looking back at a lot of these stories, and there's a huge push right now in law enforcement when we talk about mental health. What are your thoughts on that? And I'm kind of going down the road. I would think that there's a therapeutic element to doing all this writing. Would you agree with that statement?
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, yeah, because I get to relive. I'm living vicariously through myself 25, 35 years later. So yeah, it's definitely therapeutic. And what's funny is a lot of times now I connect with guys and girls that I used to work with, and I'll track them down. I'm like, hey, remember that time this happened? Actually, a guy I worked with, we recovered Mike Tyson's stolen Ducati. That's a whole other story. But I reached out to him. I go, remember when we recovered Tyson's Ducati? I go, I had to ask him to fill in the blanks with a couple of things, but it is. I get to connect with guys and girls I used to work with, and it is mental health wise. It is. You get to work through things and talk about things. In New York, we have the health service division, and In New York, if a cop goes, I'm not even talking about someone makes a complaint or they're exhibiting bizarre behavior, which has happened. But the first thing they do in New York is even if you go for help and you say, listen, I'm not feeling right, I got all these problems. The first thing they do is they put you on restricted or modified assignment. They take your guns away from you. They stamp your ID card, no guns, and then they ship you off. They ship you off to and the NYPD is so big. They kind of do the same thing to guys and girls that get in trouble. They'll send you off to Siberia, like the Whitestone Pound, where you're guarding 30,000 cars with feral cats that jump out at your feet when you're walking through rows of abandoned cars. You know what I mean? It's like, Jesus, if you're depressed now, wait till you see what we're going to send. Or you're in the court system working midnight stamping papers. So, I get that, cops carry guns, and if they're afraid someone's going to be suicidal, they want to avoid that. And, they don't want them hurting themselves or others. But there's got to be something in between. I don't quite know what that is, but you're almost punished. And I've seen it happen to people, that, they weren't feeling right. I don't think they were suicidal. I just think that, they needed somebody to talk to. And the funny thing is, after 9/11, with all that FEMA money, they started bringing us down. They brought my whole office down, which was 25 or 30 of us. And you had all these counselors, and they were nice people, but no one was talking to them. You know what I mean? It was it was like a bad internet date. You know what I mean? It was just everybody's sitting around and they're like, well, how do you feel? I feel great. You know what I mean? It was, but I mean, by the time that happened, I had 15 years in. I mean, and this from working in law enforcement. If you're going to be effective and good at your job, you got to be able to let stuff go, and you got to be able to compartmentalize things. Yeah, this happened. Yeah, it's really bad, but I'm not going to let this ruin the rest of my life.
Right.
You know what I mean? So, or when you're in the middle of something that's horrific or terrible, like that day, or I've walked into homicide scenes where I had a woman that was almost decapitated, and you're like, well, this sucks, but I got to get through it. I have to get through this. I'm here. I got to do this job, and I have to push through, and I have to accomplish my mission. I'll worry about that other stuff later. And then, you try not to take it out on your loved ones, or, you know what I mean? You got to deal with it.
Yeah, no. And I think what you're highlighting there with the way the agency would have handled things back then, it does really speak to the stigma that there is around law enforcement. And the sad thing because like you said, if they're faced with, if I seek help, I'm going to lose my gun, or could lose my gun, I may lose my career at a lot of places.
Yes.
I mean, it may not even be hiding some tucked away corner. It may lose their career altogether. So yeah, fortunately there is a large push against fighting this stigma.
Oh yeah. And I don't have an answer for it. And obviously, the mental health profession and law enforcement don't have an answer either, because I've seen it, and they will keep you on the shelf for years, because basically they look at it this way: we're paying you, we're just going to run the clock out on you.
Yeah.
We'll pay you until you get your pension, and you're going to stamp paperwork somewhere. And I've seen guys and girls for, 10 years, just wasting away somewhere, and it makes them feel worse.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely not an answer. And like you said, we definitely don't have all the answers yet, but I'm optimistic, because I've definitely seen a large push here in recent years. So let me ask you, this has been a great conversation. Let me ask you my final question that I ask everybody that comes on the show. What is the one takeaway, the one thing that law enforcement officers can do that's going to make a difference in their personal lives?
Don't be the guy or girl in the locker room. If I listen to I can speak to a New York City precinct, right? So a New York City precinct, you have a small precinct like those places in Staten Island, got 100 cops, and average size precincts about 200. And then if you go into Manhattan, some of them got 500 people. There's always going to be guys and girls in the locker room, the naysayers. Oh, don't put in for that. Don't do this. Don't be afraid to try something different. It's like, oh, I'm never going to get that detail. I'm not going to put in for it. Put in for it.
Yeah.
You never know. You know what I mean? And if you see somebody, you've got the same guys and girls that drive around in circles. They're miserable. You know what I mean? And you get the young cops, they listen to these people. We call them hairbags. in New York, like you call a handbag like a cop with uniform, salty, a cop that's got uniform deficiencies. What do you got, kid? The know-it-all, always trying to pawn a bag of shit off on an unsuspecting cop.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? So don't listen to those people. They're miserable. Don't let them bring you down. You know what I mean? Do your job. Don't worry about what they have to say. As a matter of fact, there's peer pressure. There's peer pressure in law enforcement.
Yeah.
Fuck them. You know what I mean? Do your job and worry about yourself. Don't worry about the nonsense in the locker room.
That is great advice, and it applies not just to the New York locker room. I give the same advice down here, so that is great advice. Thank you very much. What is the best way for people to connect with you?
Sure. So if you want to check out my books, they're all $10 paperbacks. They make great stocking stuffers. Just go on Amazon. Go to the book section, type Vic, V-I-C, Ferrari, like the car. My Amazon book page will come up. And if you want to get a hold of me, I'm on Instagram and Twitter at VicFerrari50.
Perfect. And I'll be sure to have all that linked up in the show notes. Vic, thank you so much for coming on. This has been an enjoyable conversation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks. So how was that? I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed recording it. Getting to sit down and talk to Vic, it was such a funny, humorous conversation. And yet we did get serious at the end, as you noticed. And we just had a really great time. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed getting to sit and talk with him. So thank you for watching or listening, however you've preferred to take on this podcast. But every episode has full show notes. We've got pictures on there. We've got links to everything discussed. We got transcriptions, really everything. If you haven't checked out the show notes pages before, I encourage you to do so. It's on theblueline.com/show notes. But the easy way to do it is whatever platform you're watching or listening to this on, just scroll down to the show notes and select the first link, which will take you to the website page. That is all for today. But don't forget that I'm going to see you Monday in Morning Roll Call. I'll see you next Thursday in the interview room. But in the meantime, I'll see you out there on the Blue Line.